Good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad I'm following you after lunch, so half of you will be asleep. You never want to get between an assembly of Métis and their lunch, so I've learned that from many years of experience. So I'm going to try to keep this reasonably short. Actually, I was speaking with Frank Tuff and with Darren O'Toole. My presentation is like a bridge between what Frank Tuff was talking about and Darren O'Toole becoming immediately afterwards. So I'm going to talk about the Maytee Nation, and I'm going to talk about the Homeland boundaries, and I'm going to try not to keep it too technical, just because I will put myself to sleep. So I'm going to be using my PowerPoint here as well, because I can't always be turning around. And I learned a trick today, not to turn your back on anyone. Will Goodon, we're all going into the men's washroom, and Will Goodon goes into the toilet and locks the door. And I'm asking, like, wait a minute, you don't use the urinal like everyone else? He says, no, he's been to meetings where people have actually pushed him against the wall as he's going to the urinal. So what he does now is he locks himself away and does the same thing. Okay? So Will hate me for that, but he's like a brother, so I'm sure I can get away with it. So what are we going to be talking about? Well, we are the Maytee Nation. I'm going to talk about a little bit about that. Defining the Maytee Nation. That's where we get all this feel good or feel angry feelings, and we put it down onto paper. Talk a little bit about M&O, the councils, the communities, and territories. It won't be anything that is controversial, I don't think. Then talk a little about the Maytee Nation homeland, the eastern boundary of the Maytee Nation homeland. That's where it starts getting controversial. And then the homeland map, which I would like to say is often called the infamous homeland map. So who are we? Well, we're the buffalo hunters. I mean, I understand that you can see a picture of a buffalo hunter, you know, in any book, on any coin, and people know that's us. So we're also, we've got a shared history. And the shared history, these are the struggles that we always talk about, right? The big ones, like the Battle of Seven Oaks or the victory of the Frog Plain. We talk about propaganda minister. Unfortunately, Will Goodon was not around at the time of the Battle of Seven Oaks in 1816, because we called it the victory of the Frog Plain. In English, they called it the Battle of Seven Oaks on a good day. Usually it was the massacre of Seven Oaks. So again, that's one battle. The Sayre trial, where we kicked the butt, as President Chartrand would say, of the Hudson Bay Company and broke their monopoly on trade. And that's where we became the free traders. Traders, not with a T, but with a D, traders. We ended up becoming, we were born out of the international, the commercial fur trade. And so long before Brian Mulrooney and everyone else talked about free trade, we had actually practiced it, and our rights were protected on that. The Red River Resistance and the Battle of Batoche, that's a picture not of the Battle of Batoche, but of Turan's Coulee or Fish Creek. Interesting enough, we talk about propaganda. That picture, you probably can't see it very well, but it's propaganda. It has the Métis at the bottom of the gully, shooting upwards, stupidest place you can be. But it was actually the other way around. It was Canada that was in the coulee, and we were shooting down on them. So we had shared history of leadership. Yes, everybody will find an ancestor in that photo somewhere. Shared struggle. This came after the Reign of Terror, the dark times, both after 1870 as 1885. And it's really unfortunate that maybe it's a crucible where we grow. Something's made new. We went through this. Many other people who say that they're Métis, their families never experienced this. And shared successes. The establishment of the province of Manitoba, the bringing of the Northwest, what's known mainly as Western Canada today, brought into Confederation by the Métis. So that's a shared struggle. And sometimes people ask me, what do you have this religious icon? Well, that's Mary holding the scales of justice. And as you notice in the picture, The big ball is up high, the big weight is up high, the little weight is down below, because this was Father Richot, who commissioned this in St. Norbert back in Winnipeg, where he wanted to show that even though the Métis Nation was so small, and Louis Riel had said this, that we were small, but we still had our rights, and even though Canada was big, they had no rights than we did. So that was our partnership with Canada. So that's who we are. We didn't need much written on paper because that's the stories our people have told us, our grandmothers, our grandfathers told us. Now, then we started putting things on paper. And one of the things is that back in 1982, thanks to Mr. Daniels and others, we had Métis put into the Constitution, as President Chartrand says, for the second time. Because the word Métis was used in 1870 in the creation of the Manitoba Act, the promise of the 1.4 million acres of land for the children that never came. But this was the second time Métis was put in. So, but what did Métis mean? Because if you look at the sentence, it says really Indian peoples, Inuit peoples, and Métis peoples. So what we did is we created our definition back in 2002, the Maytee National Council. Gerald, as I understand, and as I recall, having been there, did the move for that resolution, and President Chartrand seconded it. But Métis, and I'm going to read it out aloud, Métis means a person who self-identifies as Métis, is of historic Métis Nation ancestry, and accepted by the Métis Nation through the acceptance process. Now, I want to focus on more the territorial part of the Métis, that, you know, they have to have had ancestors in the historic Métis Nation, and the historic Métis Nation was first defined as West Central North America. So if I look on a map of North America, I think I know what West Central means, but not everybody would have the same definition. So later on in 2013, people wanted to have more clarity around what that meant. What's West Central North America? You know, what is the Maytee Nation homeland? So this 2013 resolution tries to get at that and says the geographic homeland of the Maytee Nation is the historic Northwest, which entered into Confederation in 1870 through the negotiations led by Louis Riel and the provisional government. So that helps to define it a little bit better, that the homeland is the historic Northwest. And so therefore the term West Central North America means historic Northwest. Now what is the historic Northwest? Well, let's tease apart that resolution. If you look at the map on your right, the big red circle, that's Red River. The yellow circle, little dot on the map there, that's Rainy Lake. And then you have Ontario. So in 1870, Ontario is that brownie-colored blob right there. So in what Louis Riel brought into Canada, or into Confederation in 1870, could not have included Ontario at the time of 1870 because it was already part of Ontario. It was already part of Canada. So it wasn't brought into Confederation in 1870. So it had to be everything westward from there and northward. So it created this, call it a compass. So we got this compass that's facing northwest. And so that's the area that's brought in. So today, who's on the side on the west side or northwest side, and who's on the eastern side? Now, you'll see Métis Nation Ontario is right there. Part of the people they represent, their ancestral connections, go to communities that are on the eastern side, whereas the Métis Nation, based on the resolutions, is on the northwestern side. But what you'll notice is there's a whole lot of other organizations out there too. Other ones from Ontario, from Quebec, from the Atlantic. So when I talk about, in my presentation, I talk about Eastern Canada or Eastern Métis. yeah, I guess it all depends on where you're standing. You know, I'm from Manitoba, and I went into the Wikipedia to figure out what is the definition of Eastern Canada. And Eastern Canada, by common diction, are the provinces that are east of Manitoba. That's called Eastern Canada. And then when you take Eastern Canada, you can break that up into other pieces. Central Canada, which is Ontario and Quebec, and then the Atlantic provinces or the Maritime provinces, which is everyone else. But you see, on the other side of that compass, on the eastern side, that black line, how many different organizations are out there. So as of a couple of weeks ago, when I did this PowerPoint slide, there's almost 65 different organizations. And then, now rightly so, it's been talked about, most of them have gone to court, and they've lost. They've gone to court on hunting rights to be recognized as communities or peoples. So they've lost almost 75 times. So it's getting pretty clear that, at least by legal terms, that they don't exist as communities. And it's such a big issue today. It's about who defines who the Métis are. This is just some of the newspaper articles and some of the titles that have been used. You know, who gets to be Métis? So let's talk about Maytee Nation Ontario for a while. This was in one color, all green stars, but I put some color into it because I wanted to sort of break it up. There's approximately 31, at my count there was 31, different community councils. So some of us as governing members, we call them community councils, some call them locals. But there's 31 of them. And what I've colored, there's the yellow, which is on the west side or northwest side of that compass line. And that's the Rainy Lake, Lake of the Woods area. We call it northwestern Ontario, and they're within the Homeland. Then you get east of there. I've put some two brown stars there near the middle. That's Sault Ste. Marie area. There's two locals. There could be more, but that's what I was able to ascertain. And then there's some orange ones. And those are the ones that often has become the lightning rod for these discussions, which is in the Mattawa area. And I remember back in 2010, there was a mapping of the Maytee Nation Homeland Conference, not in this room, but in another room of this hotel. And one of my questions was, where is Mattawa? Because I had never grown up with stories about where Mattawa was. My grandparents would talk about Rainy Lake. They would talk about Belcourt, North Dakota. They talk about Green Lake, Saskatchewan. They talk about places like Rocky Mountain House in Alberta. But I had never heard any stories about Mattawa. So I finally found out where Mattawa is. And what we're going to do later is we're going to follow the orange color on some future slides that I'm going to have, which will be talking about Mattawa. So those were community councils, or locals as we would call them in Manitoba. And they're connected, or they're overlaid on top of historic communities. Now, we heard this morning from President Chartrand and President Chartier about the 6 new historic Métis communities. And here we have the 7. There's actually 7 of them, but the 6 were the new ones. They assumed that the first Métis community, historic Métis community, was Sault Ste. Marie. As Métis nationalists, we probably would have thought it differently. We would have said that Rainy Lake area, Lake of the Woods, was the first Métis historic community in the Ontario area. But they've interpreted it differently, and we'll leave it to that. But you'll see on your left-hand side, we've grouped the yellow is the historic villages and settlements and forts that were for the Rainy Lake, Lake of the Woods area. And that's where Teresa and her group is from that area. Then there's the North Lake Superior, which is kind of a dark orange, or burnt orange. Then you have Sault Ste. Marie, which is the brown, like I used earlier. Killarney, Georgian Bay, and then you have Abitibi Inland, which goes up to James Bay, and then you have the Mattawa-Ottawa River area. So these are the communities that is deemed or alleged to have the rights of being a historic community. And I know that Darren O'Toole will talk about this in much more depth than I would. What's important out of this, the previous slide was from a fact sheet. There was a quote that said, the Maytee Nation Ontario represents two groups. It was from one of their own fact sheets. They represent those citizens and communities that are part of the Maytee Nation Homeland. Okay, you got Northwestern Ontario, for instance, which is Rainy Lake and Lake of the Woods, and they also represent other rights-holding communities in certain or other parts of Ontario. That would be everybody else that are on the east side. But here there was a letter that came out recently from President McCallum. And I liked the letter from President McCallum that I read. It was to the Legislative Assembly, because it helped to clarify that we're talking about two different groups. So it's not only the resolution that came from the Annual General Assembly from the Métis National Council that said, here's the boundary line, and this is the definition of homeland. But what it also did, it helped clarify that there's two groups of people we're talking about. Not just the Métis Nation and other communities. We're also talking, according to President McCallum, we're talking about what's being called historic voyageur communities. I'd never heard that term used in that way before, but at least it helps to clarify. So we've got two different groups here within the Métis Nation of Ontario. The Métis Nation community and its citizens, as finding their roots in the homeland, and then the other, which is the voyageur communities, those other rights-holding communities. So when people are part of a community, there's usually some rights that go along with it. The very minimal amount would be with a community, you have rights of self-government. But there's also, in many areas, rights to hunting and fishing, trapping. So we have here from the Métis Nation Ontario website, I've made it bright colors so I could see it a lot better. You've got the yellow, which are two harvesting territories for the Northwestern Ontario, again, Rainy Lake and Lake of the Woods. Then you've got various others, and then you've got 4 areas that more or less coincide with their communities, but the territories and the communities and the locals don't all perfectly fit. But you've got James Bay, Georgian Bay, which is the purple one and the sort of the cyan one. Then you got orange. I've kept Mattawa orange so we could follow that orange. There it is. And then there's Ottawa River. Now that's one map of their territory. In another map, they've more or less combined Mattawa and the Ottawa River. But I wanted to show this, is that when you're talking about hunting, you're hunting over an area. So you can usually put a kind of a rough circle around it or some object. And here you've got an area that's drawn for all 4. But if you look at the Quebec border slices them like you're slicing a dinner bun. You're taking a knife and you're cutting it. So where's the rest of that dinner bun? Where's the rest of that hunting territory? Why does it stop at the Quebec border for James Bay, for Abitibi, for Mattawa, and Ottawa River? Like, it doesn't make any sense. Some of that is river. So I guess you'd have to have a boat to get across. If you're a moose, you'd have to swim across. Not like that's never been done before. But animals and people move back and forth across rivers all the time. So that's just something to think about. Does it stop there? Does the hunting territory go across? Is the hunting territory and the idea of being a legitimate or rights-holding Métis community even is correct to say on the Ontario side? And that's the question of what's happening in not just that area, but all the way back to that black compass where those 2 arrows are. So I'm going to focus on 2 extremes of Ontario. On the one hand, Rainy Lake, Lake of the Woods. I'll talk about that one later. But firstly, I want to go to the one that's the orange. Remember, I'm using orange for Mattawa. And there's a drawing of what Mattawa looks like in closer detail up in the top right-hand corner. And talk about, what are the differences and what are the things we need to think about. One of the things we need to consider is a quote here that is actually from a fact sheet that M&O put out. And it says, a non-Métis person from Eastern Canada would not be eligible for an M&O citizenship card, and says that the historic Maytee Nation Homeland does not include Eastern Canada. So I'm going to focus on Mattawa, and I got two somewhat definitions of what Mattawa is geographically. But what's important is the first one's from actually M&O describing the area that's represented by the community of Mattawa. And the other one is from a court case called the Tromblay case, which took place in Quebec, just on the other side of the border. But what's important about both definitions, whether it be M&O's or the court's definition, they both say it's about crossing the river, the Ottawa River, moving from Ontario into Quebec. So the first one from M&O says that it's centered at Mattawa and spanning the Ottawa River. So it's spanning, it's going across. And in the court case, it says that it's asking the question, can you have a community that has all these locations and also crosses both sides of the river? So I took the areas from both definitions, placed them on a map. They're basically the same, and you come out with this triangle. And it's kind of a lopsided triangle, cut off the sharp point. But you have the Mattawa area, it crosses the border, so you have that dark dotted line going up the middle, that's the Ottawa River. And it goes from Lake Nipissing, Temiskaming, Fort Coron, and others, but it takes up that general area. I mean, there it is, Ottawa and Montreal, just at the bottom right-hand corner of your map. But that's the area that Mattawa is, approximately. It's already going into Quebec. It's already in Eastern Canada, as in my opinion, most of Ontario already is Eastern Canada. But that's the map. Now, there's another area where there's another court case. This one was called the Trombley case. There was a Séguin case that came out 2 years earlier. No one talks about it. It's not necessarily the best case for anyone, but its location is right there. So it's another community that was allegedly to have existed. And in that case, just like in the Mattawa case, they failed in the courts. The courts said there's no Métis community. Now, they're both from the Quebec courts. They weren't from Ontario courts. It wasn't the Ontario government or the Quebec government supporting these concepts of there being two communities. But you got two communities. They're both along the border. Maniwaki and Mattawa. One is called Séguin court case, and the other one is Trombley. The summary of the court judgments will be top and bottom. The top is very clear. Trombley, representing himself for Mattawa community, which is that M&O community out in crossing the border. The court said he didn't show that there was a Métis community there. There's no historic Métis community. So that was the Trombley case in 2018. If you go to the bottom, it would be in 2016 for that Maniwaki, which was overlapping it. What the court said, it would be easier to nail Jello to the wall, to use a colorful expression, than to situate the ins and outs of the remarkably vague and elusive allegations that there is the existence of a Métis community. So in both cases, the area in and around Maniwaki and Mattawa, they lost in the courts about there being a Métis community there, or Métis communities. Now, interestingly, for the Trombley case, when the case came out, there was a news release by M&O called M&O Reacts to Recent Court Decision on Métis Rights back in 2018. And the question was in their frequently asked question sheet, Mr. Trombley is an M&O citizen, an M&O harvester card holder, and M&O leadership testified at the trial. So the question is, was the M&O involved in the case? And the short answer was, no, the M&O was not involved. This sort of reminds me when you watch the movies and there's a CIA guy, he's told that if you get caught, we're gonna like cut the strings, like we're not gonna admit we know you. This is almost the same thing. The guy's a harvester card holder, a citizen, and he had leadership. And they were using, in part, the M&O research they had done for Mattawa. It was like he was the balloon or the kite that they were floating, and they cut the string, saying, "Oh, we're not involved." So that's an interesting quote. I'll just be a few more minutes. So I'm not going to talk about, now we move to the other end of the province, the western end, the end where you're clearly within the arms of that compass. And we're talking about Rainy Lake and Lake of the Woods. Now, this information of what represents this community, this is information from M&O. M&O has admitted that they represent Maytee Nation community or communities. This one is clearly one. And what actually involves this community. So this is a map. Again, the big red dot is Winnipeg, Red River. And let's say 3, 6, the 8 dots here are historical villages or settlements, and they're grouped into one community by the Métis Nation Ontario. I just wanted to show where they were. I mean, the time to travel from Winnipeg to Fort Frances is about the amount of time it takes to go from Winnipeg to Regina. So it's actually very close. So what we did is we took those settlements, we used the harvesting territories that had been in earlier maps. This is just a graphic representation. And we put down harvesting territories. You've got the communities. There's a transport route, the Dawson Trail that came in around 1870 when it was upgraded. I mean, it was an existing trail before from that community to Red River. And then there's the red line, squiggly, that's the Winnipeg River system to go from the Lake of the Woods to Winnipeg. Back in the old days, people still do it today just for a good time, but find themselves sitting on the beach on the Lake Winnipeg for about 3 days in bad weather. But it was one that they actually used as well. So that's the connections. So we said that's the territory that's being used as per M&O's information. Those are the historic communities that have been grouped into one larger community called Lake of the Woods and Rainy Lake. So what we did is we put a line around it. And the edge on the right can be movable, because this hasn't been done at a detail where we're all sitting down doing harvester maps, looking at the information from recent memory about where people hunted, where the families have their traditional spots. But that includes more or less all of the Treaty 3 area, as well as the harvesting territories, as well as the traditional communities or posts and villages. And what's important too is that we remember from that resolution back in 2013 is you can't go into Ontario. The resolution was that it was that territory brought into Confederation in 1870 by Louis Riel. So it can't include the province of Ontario, because the province of Ontario was already there in 1870 up to that point where that blue dotted line is. So it can go as far as that to following the resolution. So this is an artist's rendering. This is the infamous map that's raised some eyebrows. So Red River's the red dot. You see the little, the nose that is poking into Ontario. That is the northwestern Ontario, Lake of the Woods, Rainy Lake. And then it shows, where it may be, because that was the one that we spent a lot of time on, but we didn't look into what's happening in northern United States. We know we all have relatives there. I mean, some of them are distant. People like Will's family, they have people being born on both sides of the border. I've got older cousins from a long time ago. And we haven't looked into northwestern Ontario or much into BC. So this is that is a lot of work that still needs to be done. But that's the map, because at the time when we were working on this, we were more focused on what's happening on the eastern boundary. How do we figure out where the eastern boundary is of the Métis Nation homeland? So thank you very much. That's my presentation.